Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. I'm Ayya Soma. Good to see some of the friends checking in. Hello to Charsley, Greg, Manal, and everyone else who hasn't checked in yet, but is watching. That I see as a little number on the screen. So before we begin this Sutta study this morning, we're going to start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, the reason why we're gathered here today. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namasami. And hello to some other friends, Bhumika, Sam, Karuna, good to see you, Sud. So I will post on the comments the sutta that we will be reading this morning. It will be from Bhante Sujato's translation of the Itivuttaka. So it's the Musavada Sutta. So Itivuttaka 25. So the sutta begins. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one. That is what I heard. Mendicants, for an individual who transgresses in one thing, there is no bad deed they would not do, I say. What one thing? It is this, telling a deliberate lie. The Buddha spoke this matter. On this, it is said. When a person, spurning the hereafter, transgresses in just one thing, lying, there is no evil they would not do. This too is a matter that was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So it's a very beautiful, concise sutta about what really actually stuck. I've been actually translating the Itivuttaka from Pali to Italian. So I'm sharing the translation from Bhante Sujato in English because I haven't done the English translation just yet. But when I was translating these verses, what really sort of stuck in my mind was actually the connotation of lying in association with also essentially the rejection of the afterlife. And so even though it's kind of like on the margin of this sutta, obviously the main point is the precept of not lying and its implications. What I really thought was very interesting was, once again, the connotation of how by rejecting the afterlife and lying with this condition coming into being, then we also create the conditions for many evil things to be done later. So it's in sort of kind of opening the doors to everything. Coming somewhat basically like the asavas, right? So flowing out from our experience, flowing out from our heart, flowing out from our minds. So we not seeing the implications also of holding one belief, like not understanding, not thinking, disregarding that there is anything after this world. Then basically we it has more implications essentially than we might think. And so we see another sutta actually also in the Itivuttaka, in the Vijja Sutta, where actually the Buddha gives a little bit more context. He clarifies how ignorance is fundamentally the cause of acting unskillfully. And basically the lack of hiriyottapa, that Bhante Sujato translates as conscience and prudence, Bhikkhu Bodhi translates as fear and dread. This stems basically from the ignorance. It stems from avidya. And he also pretty much highlights how every dreadful destiny we have, every dreadful experience that we have in both this life and then in the next life stems from avidya. And pretty much greed and desire is the filling of it. But obviously the root cause is avidya. And there is another sutta then also in the Tipitaka, the Desana Sutta, that beautifully actually gives this recommendation of seeing evil as evil. So understanding an evil action as an evil action. And then once we understand, once we have the vidya, essentially, when we have the understanding of how evil it is, then to become dispassionate from it and to stop doing it, so to refrain from acting unskillfully. But obviously why is it so important? Why is there so much a correlation also of understanding that our life fundamentally is not limited to what we call this life, but there is actually another life. Because fundamentally, even within this life, we have multiple lives. Every action has a consequence, right? What I've done in the past is still reflecting on my life today. So that was a past life, and everything that we're going to do has both an implication, has an effect on this life and also in future lives. But when we have a sort of somewhat limited idea, limited sort of sense of it not being a continuous circle, but rather a kind of not seeing a tomorrow, but just seeing too much of a here and now. We actually emphasize so much here and now in Buddhism, but it is actually very important to understand here and now, but also in relation to also the future and also in relation to the past. So what we've done in the past influences the here and now, and what we're doing here and now also influences what we're going to experience in the future. And so when we remove actually the implication of our actions in the future, of how that shapes essentially our experience of reality, then there is no really much thing that we can restrain ourselves from. It's difficult to actually understand how something evil is in fact evil, how something that is an unwholesome action can really actually have unwholesome results. So when, even besides the lying, but the stealing, the anything, right? The stealing can be actually very pernicious. Right now, here and now, there is an object that I want. Here and now, there is an experience that I want. Here and now, there is a person that I want, right? So here and now, that acquiring of that object, that acquiring of that experience, that acquiring of that person will, without a doubt, bring some gratification, will without a doubt, right, bring something that is a coarse form of happiness. And so if we don't have the understanding of the implications that go further, that have, by doing that action, what is the danger in the future? What are the implications of that in the future, right? Then it will be very difficult to actually have a sense of understanding that actually the appropriate response would be to restrain oneself, that the appropriate response would be not to take what has not been given, right? The appropriate response would be moderation. And then we would actually also be not very interested in even searching for truth, right? So then coming back to the sutta that we see here, the implications on lying. So how come actually is it such a dreadful thing? That the Buddha says, actually, if one lies, then there is nothing else that one cannot do. Because to a certain degree, actually, lying is something that is on a more subtle sort of more refined form of action. It's something that we do that we can justify very easily. That is not as perhaps even as coarse as what we were talking about earlier of stealing, right? Stealing, there's like an object that is being stolen. There is something really more tangible, more materialistic about it. But actually, the lying is, we have so many different ways of being capable of justifying that and not seeing actually the implications of that action, of how it tends the mind towards avidya. And on the flip side, actually, when we are sticking to the truth, how it basically creates a habit of the mind leaning towards instead vidya, towards knowledge, right? The more we stick towards what we actually know, the more we speak something that we can stand confident by, right? Something that we're experiencing, not just our opinions, not our, what we want to say, but actually something that we have an experience of truth, right? Like, I'm hungry, right? We can know that, or I'm full, right? We can know that. It's a true statement, very simple statement. But actually just saying even, I'm not hungry when we're actually hungry. Or we are hungry when we're not hungry. Something as kind of doesn't seem that it's that blameful, right? Or that it has many implications, but yet actually creates a connotation of the mind. It creates a tendency of the mind to stray away from what is in fact the experience that we're having, what is actually the truth of things. And so when we start essentially training the mind in that way, and obviously the example that I made is very subtle. It's not, doesn't have that much of a weight, right? But when we get into doing something that is more, that has more sort of effects and on others, right? Then that also creates a training of the mind to be even more callous, more indifferent, more careless. I'm thinking very much, actually, my parents had this caretaker who worked for them for 3 months, and she unfortunately ended up being a thief. So we discovered that she was a thief, but the way that was actually, what was really shocking about the stealing process for me wasn't necessarily the stealing of the objects, which was actually a significant amount of stuff that she stole, but the manner that she did it. And the manner in which she did it was by lying with me, and also by lying with my mom, right? So my mom has some cognitive problems these days, and so she tends to forget where she has placed things, where she has moved things. And so the worker essentially took advantage of this situation by intentionally moving certain things, intentionally moving certain objects, so that my mom would get very confused. And so that then when she wouldn't find the objects that were stolen, then the worker would fundamentally do what is these days called gaslighting. So pretend that it had been my mom who had moved things around, and would tell her, no, I didn't take this, I didn't remove this thing. It's part of your disease that you have. You don't know where these objects are. And it was the same, with us when my parents were sharing, this situation, and she was also contextualizing it, and we were also believing in this lie. So what I thought then, many different things happened in the past months, but this really made me think, because while I was talking to this lady who was quite young, she was in her late 20s, And she was talking about once with me how she was suffering from a lot of anxiety and a lot of agitation and a lot of different afflictions that she was not capable of quite addressing, knowing what to do about it. And she couldn't even understand where they were coming from. And once we discovered, this whole Pandora's box of these unwholesome actions, then for me it was really clear. It was really obvious, because whenever we actually do something negative, when we do something that is not in accordance with Dhamma, then dukkha arises in the mind. And the mind is full of avijja. So we actually want to get out of this dukkha that we're experiencing, but we keep on doing the same sort of action that we think is going to bring us happiness, but instead is actually creating even more conditions for that dukkha to happen in the mind. So after this whole sort of story that happened with my parents, it was very interesting how the knowledge, having the Dhamma, understanding this process, made me have no experience of hatred towards this person, even though she had mistreated both of my parents. But I had so much compassion. I still have so much compassion for her, because of understanding precisely what the Buddha says in these 3 suttas that I presented to you today. So there is just no end, of bad destinations that one can take whenever one doesn't have access to the Dhamma and that cannot understand really what evil is, right? Seeing evil, as the Buddha says in the Dissana Sutta. And then, of course, there's a bad destination right here in this life, and then also in further lives. So it's very important to actually see this, not being too focused on the here and now, on being too focused on the present moment, but rather being focused in the present moment to understand how in the present moment thoughts of greed, hatred, and delusion appear. How does the mind create these conditions for greed, hatred, and delusion to appear in the mind, and to dismantle them? That is the purpose of why we're here and now. Not to just be in the here and now for the sake of the here and now, not to be in the here and now to create some sort of lack of responsibility for the future, not to be in the here and now, not to worry about whether there is actually an afterlife, but rather to understand how this process, once again, of greed, hatred, and delusion comes into being, and how to stop it once and for all, how to relinquish any evil action that we do, how to train ourselves essentially not to have this kind of constant explosion of impulses that we have in every moment and that we follow in every moment. And so instead, to restrain ourselves and to cultivate actually what is good. And then finally to reach the end of the afterlife, as in the end of this sort of constant cycle of birth and death, right? So to then create the conditions for the lack of death and the lack of birth to happen, which doesn't mean annihilation, doesn't mean not existing anymore, but it just means removing these conditions for dukkha to appear in the mind. So these are just a few thoughts that come to mind this morning on this sutta. Now, if there's any questions or comments, feel free to type them in. And hello in the meanwhile to Johannes, AS, Alisa, actually. John, Amaranta, good to see you. Salmin, welcome to all our friends here. So I don't see any questions just yet. I will type in the other 2 suttas that I spoke about this morning. So the Vijja Sutta is Itivuttaka 40. And the Desana Sutta is Itivuttaka 39. So Johannes says, thank you, Ayya Soma. It seems hard to come up with proof of rebirth, even though one may believe in it and make educated guesses about it through one's own experiences and insights. But what would you say are the closest thing to proof? Once again, I feel like we have a little bit too much of focus on sort of this life in the sense of the birth and the death, right? So we tend to think of only one life, and that we can be actually quite sure of. But actually, none of us really can remember, for example, their moment of birth in this life, right? So that's already something that we take out of faith. Maybe we've seen a birth certificate, maybe they told us, maybe, our parents spoke about the moment, that we were born. But it's just really something that we take out of faith, really. And so we see there is already that we should actually take into consideration. The other thing that comes also into being is what is it that is, in fact, what we think we are, right? What is it that we, like even this body, right? Forget about all our mental predispositions. But this body already, like Western science tells us that, Ayya Soma's body is radically different than what we called Ayya Soma's body when she was 4 years old, or actually even Ayya Soma's body yesterday. But definitely there is, some similarities, some actual material, some substance that is very similar to yesterday, but that is completely gone, is something radically different than the one that I had when I was so-called 4 years old, that I have pictures of when I was 4 years old. I remember when I was about 4 years old, right? So already that body has died, and already that body has been reborn multiple times, right? And also the aspirations that Ayya Soma had when she was 4 years old. I remember when I was 4 years old, I wanted to be a lawyer. Then when I was 5, I wanted to be a ballerina. Then when I was 6, I wanted to be a finance person. Then when I was 6, I wanted to be a Catholic nun. Then when I was 7, I wanted to be a construction worker. No kidding. There was a lot of different aspirations, right, in this mind. Then there was a time when I liked to draw. There was a time when I was an extrovert. There was a time when I was an introvert, right? There was a lot of different characteristics of mind. There was a time when, this mind was very angry. There was a time when it was softer. And so what are these essentially new people coming into being? How are they shaping up? And that's basically through karma, fundamentally, through intentional actions that create a different result. So we can see that if we look closely within what we call this life, we can see how today's Ayyā Somā, who is a Buddhist monk, right, sitting at Empty Cloud Monastery, is the product of many different intentional actions that have been done in this life. And there's also some other sort of byproducts that are a little bit of a question mark or a mystery mark. But still, you can see a lot of cause and consequence. Now then, what was the cause and consequence of the proclivities of the mind, of the tendencies of the mind, and also of the sort of aspects of the body that came into being on that date when Ayya Soma was born, right? Where it says on her birth certificate, and when her parents spoke about when she was born. So usually the answer that we have when we are not informed by the Buddhist teachings is that it's just random, right? It's just kind of chaotic mess. And then what happens to if I were to die right now, all the intentional actions that I've done so far and that I'm also doing right now, where are the consequences? Well, we say that basically kind of everything dies with the body. So that's a materialistic view. It actually contradicts, I would say, our experience of what we can actually see, which is our life, that is all causes and consequences, right? Both material and immaterial. So our body depends on our diet, for example, right? So it is the fruit of intentional actions of how we feed the body. Similarly, the mind is, our mental experience is definitely the product of everything that we feed into our mind, right? All these tendencies of mind. So I would say it's actually quite bizarre to think that this experience that we can see, just has a random beginning and a random end, rather than actually being the sort of continuum, which is what the Buddha is essentially pointing out. So I would say that is the biggest proof. We don't have to necessarily go and read too many books. We don't necessarily have to believe in something, but rather we should actually look at our experience, look at the implications of our actions, allow ourselves to really, really do this work. But if you think otherwise, please feel free to type in your thoughts. And Sud says, Dear Ayya, how should one respond to cheating and lying like this? Though I'm compassionate, the mind tends to harbor quite a lot of negative feelings. Though I work positively despite negative feelings, they seem to keep arising. How should one eliminate these negative feelings altogether? Well, first of all, I wouldn't recommend, being too forceful. So it is a process. It's a process of really also understanding our heart, really understanding these kilesas, and really understanding the Dhamma. Back in the day, it would have been really, really difficult not to feel, for example, in the account that I was sharing earlier, not to feel angry at the person, at the caretaker of my parents, at the caregiver of my parents, right? Not to have resentment towards her, not to want to have any type of revenge, right? So what was different right now? Well, what was different was actually what I was explaining earlier to our friend Johannes, who was asking about rebirth. So seeing this causality, so seeing this cause and effect in my heart, in my mind, right? So for example, when I stopped killing insects, when I took the precept of not harming, not killing any sentient being, not only humans, well, that radically shifted my experience of the world. That radically brought me towards much happiness, and shed a lot of irritation, a lot of dukkha that I didn't even know was there, or rather that maybe perhaps I knew was there, but I didn't know what it was caused by. And so when we start understanding, for example, that killing sentient beings, like this evil action of killing sentient beings, produces an evil result in our mind of dukkha. And then we start observing every time we make something, we do a wholesome action, how it produces a wholesome result in our mind and heart. Then we create, once again, that tendency towards knowledge, that tendency towards understanding the Dhamma, that tendency of really being in sync with what the Buddha says. And then that automatically creates a condition for compassion to come into being. Because when we see others acting unskillfully, not in accordance with Dhamma, we understand that the implication of those actions will lead them to tremendous suffering. And that is really, really difficult to see. That breaks the heart. So when we see something heartbreaking, there is no anger for that person that is experiencing something heartbreaking, right? Because there is vicca. But when we have the idea that that person is committing something evil and there is no repercussion for their actions, then that's when our hatred, that's when our dukkha, like our upset, sort of comes up, because we, to a certain degree, don't understand the Dhamma, and we think that they deserve to be punished in one way, which is very, very different. When we think that someone deserves, some type of punishment, it's very different from understanding that they will receive a bad result. The latter produces compassion. The first one produces anger and resentment. I don't know if I'm very clear in describing the difference between the two. And so the first one is also something that I would say is the result also of our not quite understanding the implications of our actions, not quite understanding the implications of the Dhamma. And it's not something that happens overnight, we have to constantly develop that. So I explained, I shared my success moment with a worker of my parents, but sometimes, I'm also not that skillful, right? There's also like not success sort of stories where the mind goes towards like, yeah, that's not good. That shouldn't be happening. That, right? And so we should learn both from our success stories and from our unsuccess stories, stories when we are not successful in going in accordance with Dhamma, and checking why do we have that urge? Why do we have that? Why does our heart incline over there? And so then that means we need to go back and also see how that anger, how that resentment, how all those negative feelings, as you call them, how they, how they're hurting us, how they are bringing us dukkha. And so once again, we can take it as an opportunity to have even more faith in the teachings of the Buddha, because we can see the truth of that, of right here, right now. This is dukkha. Yeah. Speaker of truth is never wrong. So we can see how that is harming ourselves. And so when we see something as negative, we can go back to the Desana Sutta. We can see an evil action as evil. So that brings bad results. And then we can become dispassionate from it. We can cultivate non-interest towards it. We can go like, yeah, this is quite sucky. I don't really want to do this anymore. And so it's more of an experiential, I would say, practice. I hope that was helpful. And AS says, thank you for updating the Amazon wish list. Well, thank you so much for your beautiful aspiration of supporting the Sangha. And Amaranta says, good morning, Ayya. Sometimes I have conflict with the Buddha's advice on right speech, especially when someone is lying in the moment. Is the moment right? I think it's more important to say that is a lie. Okay, I understand what you're saying. If someone in that moment is lying, whether or not it is important to say that it is a lie. I mean, it's difficult to suggest precisely what the appropriate response is in those moments, because it's obviously the context can vary very much. But I would say that it's always a good idea to check our motivation, right? Why do we want to say what we want to say? Because sometimes something, as Ajahn Chah used to say, can be true, but not right. So we should always go, I think in this case, back into the instructions of how to give admonishment, because this would be in the sort of scope of giving admonishment to someone. And so, of course, the first requisite is to understand when something is true or false. So in this case, we know that the person is lying. So yes, it is true. But we should also ask ourselves, is this beneficial? Right? Like, would actually there be any benefit in me admonishing this person and highlighting the fact that they are saying something that is not true? And can I say this gently? Is my mind full of loving kindness or not? Right? So making sure that these prerequisites are there before we can actually we actually say something about that. Okay. And Greg says, I think that how you view rebirth also probably depends on how you view self. What do you think? Not quite sure what you mean by that. How you view the self? Well, if you can give a little bit more context on what you're trying to say, Greg, that would be very helpful. And Johannes says, thank you. Yes, it's hard to account for the wildly different characteristics of beings on a materialistic basis. And it's the theory of a random causeless arising of things. Correct. Yes, actually, this is one of the things that really got me very interested in the teachings of the Buddha, is that first and foremost, actually, the Buddha gives us an answer for everything, really. So it's a complete path. There's nothing random. It's all an experience of causality, and we can actually use it to see, to explore with these lenses our experience. And what turned me into a monastic was that I was never able to prove the Buddha wrong. And so this creates a lot of faith in my heart, where then my mind stops being so too rational for the sake of being rational. Because when we're too rational, sometimes we become very irrational, actually. And a materialistic view actually is also not unique of these days. We think that because of the progress, or so-called progress in science, the so-called progress with technology, etc., that we have so much more knowledge, but actually it's really not true. A materialistic view has been present since beginningless time, and definitely was present at the time of the Buddha, and definitely the Buddha highlighted how it was a wrong view. And so maybe, kind of the characteristics of the materialistic approach that we have this day is slightly different from the materialistic view at the time of the Buddha, but the substance, it's basically the same sort of, the same Ichaditi. And Charlie says, is there a difference between a person who steals from another person, like your mother's caregiver or pickpocket, and a person who steals from a faceless corporation, like a Walmart shoplifter? I mean, yes and no, in the way that I would say probably the first one has a stronger karma, but the latter one is still strong karma. Because fundamentally what we're talking about is the action of stealing. And so it's a habit of stealing. So, whatever we're smoking, yes, there are certain substances that are worse than others, but we're still taking on the habit of smoking. That is a difficult habit then to relinquish, to let go of. So when we think of sila as habits, rather than as something that is just morally good or right, like in a more abstract way, but we think of it as in habits, then I find that very helpful, because we can understand, do I actually want to take this habit of stealing? It doesn't matter whether it's stealing towards someone or stealing towards a corporation that is evil, etc., but rather the habit of stealing, that tendency of the mind. Because even stealing, the sort of Robin Hood scenario, stealing from an evil corporation to go to the free, we're still actually creating that karma of stealing that then will lead us towards stealing from also the more vulnerable people in the world, because it's a habit, right? So a habit that is unrestrained just will keep on leading us towards that, in that direction. And so we want to actually cultivate really good habits and nourish those, because we know that those will bring us in a very good destination. And Greg says, a person views rebirth differently depending on how he views the idea of a self. Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure I still get what you're trying to say, but obviously the teachings of the Buddha are all about, right, anatta. So understanding the impersonality of these things. And I think when we talk about karma and rebirth, we tend to take it really personally. We tend to think of it really as me, right? But it's actually, even when we talk about the 4-year-old me and the 40-year-old me right now, we're talking about radically different people, as I was saying. And so we can actually understand also through there the impersonality of it. And then also understand how the rebirth process is all a process of, yeah, impersonality. It's impersonal. There is no such thing as something that is definitely there, constantly reliable, that I can call me. And also what will be reborn is also not something that really that I have to hold on to. But I can understand that even if, I am not the person anymore when I was 4 years old, that those actions that 4-year-old person did do have an effect on me today. And that experience of suffering that I have today, I really don't want to bring along, right? I don't really want to nourish in the future. So yes, if we tend to think of some of ourselves as something solid, something really really tangible, then really immutable, then of course we'll have a hard time understanding the process of rebirth right now, right here in this moment, tomorrow, in the past, and of course future lives and previous lives and so forth. So I don't know if that was helpful, but that's what comes to mind. And hello to Chaisa, watching live from Bangladesh, and also Venerable Gyanaratna. Good to see you, Venerable. So I think that's all from today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and hopefully I'll see you again very soon. May you all be well, happy and peaceful, and may all good things come to you. We can end this morning with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.